High in the mountains of Colorado sprawls a vast army post known to servicemen throughout the world.
Fort Carson, Colorado, home to the U.S. Army's 4th Infantry Division.
If you want to understand the history of the Pikes Peak region, you have to understand two things. One is the history of health care in the Pikes Peak region, people coming here seeking a cure for tuberculosis and for other health conditions, and the other is understanding the history of the military.
The Surgeon General looked at Colorado Springs and Fort Carson as being a major hospital location. And it's that hospital that I think is most interesting.
POW's camp's interesting. Again, that was originally intended for an Italian internment camp. Italian prisoners were the first ones to arrive. They arrived in early '43.
Examine the military, just as I described it, as an economic driver, not just as a military post, but as an element in the community that attracted people, attracted contractors here. It brought people in, and you see the impact of the military if you look at our population changes over time.
A look through time at the Mountain Post on this edition of Fort Carson Now. Fort Carson, Colorado, home of the 4th Infantry Division, is located in El Paso County, a teeming urban, suburban, and rural area. Colorado Springs, its largest city, is the gateway to some of Colorado's most beautiful mountain geography, such as the Garden of the Gods and Pikes Peak. The area has long been a sought-after tourist destination and retirement location.
If you want to understand the history of the Pikes Peak region, you have to understand two things. One is the history of health care in the Pikes Peak region, people coming here seeking a cure for tuberculosis and for other health conditions, and the other is understanding the history of the military. Those two drivers have directly influenced the history of our region more than any others. We were a pretty stable 30,000 people for decades leading up to World War II. The 3 decades prior to World War II, our population actually fell by about 15%, largely because of the Depression.
Colorado Springs was in the running at the end of 1941 with about 9 other locations around the nation to have an installation built here. But December 7th, 1941 kind of changed the whole aspect of what was going on. Before that, it might have been considered a competition between different locations after December 7th. All of a sudden, financial arrangements were raining down upon the country, and Colorado Springs was notified on January 6, 1942, that they had been selected for a new installation, which was yet to be named. It wasn't named from the very start.
We actively went out and sought Camp Carson, what it was called at the time. Leading individuals in our community's history saw an opportunity, even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that there was going to be military expansion, saw an opportunity to bring in the Army, and they knew the impact that would have on the economy locally. And so the advocacy that happened, working with congressional delegation in Washington, promoting this place as a good location for a new camp, was what secured it for Colorado Springs. There were several factors that made Colorado Springs appealing to the Army at the time. The man most directly responsible for securing Camp Carson in Colorado Springs is a man named H. Chase Stone, leading banker, business leader in the community, and he saw the opportunity for year-round training here because of our ideal weather. The city went out and purchased a large tract of land that would serve as a place for training. Our central location within the country, all of those factors were appealing to the military.
The facility was called a cantonment, meaning a large camp where men are trained for military service. Because the United States was rapidly gearing up for war in the European and Asian theaters, there was no plan for the installation beyond the immediate need of training draftees.
H. Chase Stone came here to recover from tuberculosis. He went to school in the East, came down with tuberculosis, was looking for a good place to relocate, came to Colorado Springs, became a leading banker, and had large interests in real estate locally. Saw the opportunity in 1941. The military needed to grow because of international threats. It's always hard in history to identify one figure who's responsible for given events, but if you wanted to pick one person who is the key mover and shaker in the establishment of Camp Carson locally, that's H. Chase Stone. Kit Carson, perhaps the most famous Indian fighter, Indian agent, frontiersman of his era, grew up in the Midwest, came out here looking for adventure, ultimately rose to the rank, I believe, of general in the U.S. Army. Spent most of his time as a frontiersman out, before settlement happened, and just really made a name for himself on the frontier. First as an Indian fighter, as I said, and then as an Indian agent, working with the federal government and the Indian nations, trying to live up to our treaty obligations. Very well known as a mythic figure, iconic figure in the American West. And when the post was located here, probably no better figure to identify with the frontier than Kit Carson.
The Pikes Peak area, long reliant on tourism and medical recuperation, found itself in decline during the Great Depression. But the bombing of Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into war, and the fate of Colorado Springs was reversed with the presence of the new training center. A look at the camp and its activities when Fort Carson now continues.
Mine was earned off Vietnam in 1968.
Over the South Pacific in 1943.
I got mine in Iraq 2003.
USAA auto insurance is often handed down from generation to generation because it offers a superior level of protection and because USAA's commitment to serve the military, veterans, and their families is without equal. Begin your legacy. Get an auto insurance quote. USAA. We know what it means to serve.
With the tourist economy of Colorado Springs and the Pikes Peak area declining during the Depression, and the U.S. military's need for training millions of soldiers for war, Camp Carson benefited both the community and the nation.
Examine the military as an economic driver, not just as a military post, but as an element in the community that attracted people, attracted contractors here. It brought people in, maybe not directly working on post, but brought them here. And you see the impact of the military if you look at our population changes over time.
January 7, 1942, Camp Carson was established. Thousands of workers from all over the Rocky Mountain region arrived to begin building the training center. On June 2, 1942, the first buildings were accepted, and on July 15, the 89th Infantry Division was activated. During World War II, over 104,000 soldiers trained at the camp. One of the units training at Camp Carson and its satellite facility, Camp Hale, was the 10th Mountain Division.
Well, the 10th Mountain was focused on, as the name implies, fighting in the mountains. How do you do that? In order to train for those conditions, you need a mountainous environment. That's what this offered. A lot of the training happened up near Leadville. They had to train, they'd bring in kids who, had never touched a ski or seen a ski. And you have to teach them how to use mountaineering equipment, skiing equipment in a combat situation. The 10th Mountain Division was located here in the early years. A lot of the training happened up at Camp Hale.
The National Ski Patrol are recruiting skiers and mountaineers to go into a specialized unit in the Army. The Army has never had any troops specialized before, but we have seen that the war in Europe is on, and they are using mountain troops. And the story is that we've looked at what the troops in Europe have done and finally decided that we should have some mountain troops.
They came here, and of course everybody knows that they weren't actually at Fort Carson. They were up at Camp Hale, up near Leadville, about 10, 15 miles, I guess, east of Leadville. It was about a mile across and 3 miles long. Each individual that came down here to volunteer, and we had people that thumbed from Alaska to come all the way down to Fort Carson because they heard they were starting this cold weather school and Arctic training type thing. To be eligible to get in, they had to come in with 3 letters of references.
You have to have 3 letters of recommendation telling your skiing ability, your mountaineering ability, or your ability to stay alive in cold weather.
The gentleman that was turned to was a Minnesotan, and the Army turned to him and asked him to come down to be the instructor. And he was the one that kind of gave, I guess, what you might call a European flavor to our mountain troops that we sent over just a few months later. The training was very strenuous. They had to do a lot of things. They even took the mules as well as dogs up there to Camp Hale to slowly adapt the animals to the environment and the labors required.
The first winter maneuvers, when they brought the mules up, there was a long mule train. And not only did they have the weapons, the pack howitzer, but they had mules that carried food and supplies for the infantry. So the mule pack outfit was a complete separate unit that had those 2 missions, to not only supply a battery of artillery, but also to carry supplies at the same time. And seeing those mule trains come up those long mountain trails was quite a sight.
And the 10th Mountain would eventually be deployed into 5th Army territory under General Mark Clark, and they would fight in northern Italy in the Apennine Mountains. And the interesting thing about the 10th Mountain after World War II was some of them returned to Colorado Springs, and they formed a foundation of what probably turned into more of the commercial aspects of the ski industry in Colorado Springs.
There are heads of major corporations that came out of the 10th Mountain Division. There are officials in almost every government across the country that you can see. You can find mayors, you can find chiefs of police, you can find councilmen, and public servants, all that came out of the 10th Mountain.
Once the Cold Weather Center moved to Camp Hale was established, and Camp Hale trained several ski battalions before the 10th Mountain Division was organized at Hale. And once the Mountain Division was organized, and a lot of the assets came, which the field artillery was one of the assets to the division, and they trained at Hale, so they would process at Carson and move up to Hale. But at the time, the primary training mission was the 10th Mountain Division, because that was 10,000 soldiers at Hale that were training for use and deployment in mountainous terrain. And as the U.S. Army pushed north through Italy to force the German Army out, they encountered many mountainous areas that the 10th was utilized in. The extension of the Cold Weather Center at Camp Hale, one of the primary training regimens or curriculums was skiing. Because the mountain troopers had to have the knowledge and ability to be able to ski, and so a lot of the training was done focused on skiing, and also on negotiating cold weather, lots of snow, lots of sub-0 degree temperatures, how to survive, how to fight as a soldier, and a lot of that was important. So. And then eventually, I know the 10th Mountain, they organized as a division, trained as a division, and then deployed down to Texas for finishing up their training before they deployed overseas.
The 10th Mountain Division was located here in the early years. A lot of the training happened up at Camp Hale. They also worked heavily with using pack animals to transport equipment. That was done here because we've got a lot of people from the mining tradition that know that, how do you use a mule to haul materials.
Pack animals, including mules, as well as a very large hospital complex. All next, as Fort Carson Now continues. Sometimes known as the Mountain Post, Fort Carson has trained soldiers for military operations since its founding in 1942. As the United States entered World War II, the construction of the facility brought many thousands more to the Colorado Springs area. A prisoner of war camp and a hospital also contributed.
In 1943, a POW camp was established at Camp Carson, initially serving Italian troops, but later the Italian troops were moved out of here and it was only German troops that were moved to Camp Carson. And the POW system in the United States was one that was kind of like a hub and spoke kind of a concept. And so Camp Carson was the center for POWs in this part of the country. But a lot of those POWs were sent out to neighboring communities in the mountains, out on the plains, and essentially worked in work camps. So some of them did forestry activities, some helped farming activities, would work on the sugar beet farms, for instance, on the plains. But this was kind of the center for that. Thousands of troops, as I understand it, were located here. It's interesting to think about, and you will hear from people who were living in Colorado Springs at the time, that they remember people walking around in uniforms, kind of work uniforms, with PW on their backs.
Initially, with the very first camp, when it was opened, and it was by itself, our initial population was Italian prisoners taken out of North Africa, brought in here. We had a couple of hundred, and by into 43, the Italians were relocated to another prisoner of war camp somewhere else in the United States, and we started seeing the influx and growth of German prisoners. And that's when the first prisoner of war camp, designed for 1,000, started to grow to its 3,000 mark. And then when it overgrossed itself, they opened up a second one, which was supposed to give us a total population of about 8,000. I think it ended up servicing by about 10,000 by the end of the war. By 1946, we had repatriated most of those, and any of the prisoners that had perished here during the war and they were buried, their remains were actually exhumed and sent back to the fatherland too.
It was called Station Hospital because it was built concurrent with the original Camp Carson construction. And because of the personnel assigned to Carson, the workforce, at the time there was no dependent, so you didn't really have to worry about a dependent because that wasn't brought into the scene. But this amount of personnel, they needed a large hospital. Towards the end of the war, they converted the Station Hospital into a convalescence hospital. And so a lot of soldiers returning from the war were being treated for, anywhere from mental disorders to physical disorders, a rehabilitation effort. And at the time, the hospital at Carson was one of the largest hospital complexes in the country. It consisted of several square miles, over 200 barrack-style cinder block buildings connected by walkways, covered walkways. So it was a really large hospital presence. Of course, post-Korean War, around 1960, early 1960s, Fort Carson has more or less a permanent divisional, presence, and so you got those troops. And at the time too, you're also, bringing dependents on for a long time there was no dependent housing on Carson. It was mainly for single individual soldiers. or their families would have to live off posts if they had those. But then once they started establishing independent housing, you had that need also that's created. Post-Vietnam, the hospital increases again because as the Army shifts to the volunteer Army, the VOLAR.
The Surgeon General looked at Colorado Springs and Fort Carson as being a major hospital location. And it's that hospital that I think is most interesting because the hospital complex that we had here prior to 1986, some of you may remember it, was a very large facility located to the west of the commissary area, or the new BX area. All that new housing at one time was nothing more than a large complex for the hospital that consisted of 57 buildings. Again, the nature of the construction for the hospital was originally going to be temporary because it was going to be for war footing purposes only. But the Surgeon General came out and notified Quartermaster after they started looking at it, saying we just cannot have wood frame buildings. We need to have something more permanent of a nature.
Unique training opportunities at the Mountain Post, including the mules, when Fort Carson now returns. Established in 1942 and named for frontiersman Kit Carson, the temporary camp became a more permanent fort in 1954. All the while, the post has offered unique training opportunities to its soldiers.
At that point, they implied permanency. Camp, they could shut down at any time, but when they went to Fort Carson, that implied a greater permanency that it was going to be here.
World War II, you see the construction of a mock French village, just for realistic training opportunities, and that provided, the first to utilize it was the 89th Division. Here were again the first division to train her. But they built an actual village as if it had been taken over by the Nazis, did realistic training with live ammunition, live munitions, and to really give the soldiers a feel of what they were going to experience in Europe, because again, timeline-wise, they were going to train as quick as they could, and they were deploying to the European theater, and they're going to be at war. And so it was a great opportunity, a great training mission. And then, of course, that Vietnam, same situation. They built a mock Vietnamese village because, again, it provides really good training opportunities, real realistic training. Because, again, a lot of the warfare being conducted in both those conflicts, strange urban, rural or urban environments, but it allows soldiers to become more in tune to what he's going to expect when he deploys. And it's still carried on today with the mock Iraq and Afghan villages. Train features that soldiers train on, today to prepare for deployments. So it's a great training tool.
It has to do with where we're situated, where the prairie meets the mountains, and it just offers so many different positive elements for training.
Look, the 4th ID, they're here, late 70, really 71 when personnel comes, but they mechanized. They were a light infantry division, but they mechanized. And so that's a new aspect of the training also. Infantry vehicles, also materials coming on with the division, so it's another progress forward. But Pinyon Canyon gave another 250,000 acres, so you could maneuver as as two brigades, possibly 3, with realistic training, and that provided that opportunity. And so again, it made Carson more important, I think. I look at the conflicts we're in now, where we're situated at. the train elements at Carson, mimic that, and so it's a great opportunity for soldiers to train. And of course, with the influx of the Combat Aviation Brigade, as proposed to stand up at Carson, that'll be another mission that they will take on, and the train lends itself to that.
They brought in to camp 3,000 mules. We had tired vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and they knew that we had to have something else that would be able to supply them in combat.
During the war, we had packed artillery, which meant we had mule trainers, mule skinners. A couple of months ago right here, we had guests come in from the East Coast, and I got into a conversation with one of the gentlemen. He was here in '56, and I guess he was one of the mule skinners that actually worked with the mules. It was interesting. They had a artillery, a couple of different types of artillery pieces that were mule towed, and of course we know that they're using mules net, I guess, in Afghanistan today for special forces. So the wheel goes around once again. Once in a while you find yourself in an environment where you fall back on the same tactics you've had to use before.
Okay, the Army in the 1940s, the mule was a primary means of supply and transportation. Field artillery units, pack units, had mules. I mean, the Pack 75 mountain howitzer was designed to be carried by mule teams into rugged terrain where the Army could not reach. Mules were also used by quartermasters for supply. As mainly a resupply mission, they were found in remote areas or rough terrain. The mule was the most efficient way to bring supplies or equipment into that area. In the tail end, when the mules disappear, it's because the helicopter becomes the primary source of movement for supplies and materials.
The interesting thing was that there were two separate cultures. They had the skiers, which had primarily come from the Ivy League schools on the East Coast, Dartmouth, Yale, Princeton, Williams. And those college-trained fellows had a culture that they'd grown up in. On the other hand, you had the cowboys, the mule packers, the mountaineers, the woodsmen, a completely different culture. Well, when they got these two separate cultures together, we thought, oh boy, we're going to have a real time. Well, as it worked out, it became a marvelous unit. The two cultures came together like gangbusters, something that had never happened before in the military. The mule packers and the cowboys knew that the infantrymen were going to take care of their well-being, and the infantry found out that they were able to get their supplies and their ammunition from that other culture. But it worked out. It worked out perfectly.
The most popular mule for Fort Carson is Hambone. Hambone is actually buried over here, I understand, in front of the Division Artillery Headquarters. That mule served, I think, 18 years with the Army, and had quite a history, and it was used in many ceremonial events, things like that, so it was quite popular.
Well, Fort Carson has got a long history of carrying on Army traditions. It's the mountain post. It's known across the Army as being the mountain post and also being one of the best hometown in America.
The ways it's changed over time is as the military is downsized in other locations, Fort Carson has been a destination for troops from maybe the Presidio in San Francisco. They're relocated here. So it becomes a destination for troops that have lost their home, other posts that are closed. And every time that happens, the size of the training grounds increases, the need for community services increases, and again, it's that interconnection between the post and the community has grown closer, more integral over the years.
A storied place, what a perfect place to put a post, what a great place for a division to be because of the facilities on the installation, the training areas
This has been a brief look through time at Fort Carson, where, since 1942, the vigilant soldiers steadfastly train, improving their skills, developing their professionalism, all to preserve our freedoms. This has been Fort Carson Now. Thanks for watching.